We are going to be recording tonight's class session. So if you're not comfortable having your video recorded, please shut off your camera. This is your list of instructors with their email addresses. Tonight's instructor is not on this email list, but if you have email for him, send it to John and he will forward it on. Tonight's instructor is Sebastian. And Sebastian, I'm not sure how we left you off the slide. I'm sorry about that.
Thanks.
Here's the overall schedule, and we are in week 4. Congratulations. We are more than halfway through, or we are fully halfway through the primary part of the class. And we have tonight and 2 more sessions, and then the fun begins. Well, I guess Bob's already fun, but you know, anyways. Here's a more detailed schedule for tonight. We're in this introduction right now. Sebastian's going to be talking about weak signal propagation and outer space. And then we're going to be hearing from Nigel about his experience with ham radio. Sebastian will talk about digital. And then Dan will talk about working races and parades. And then Sebastian will continue with multimode radio. And then we'll hear from Roxy about her experience with ham radio. And then Sebastian will talk about interference protection. At the end, Bob will talk about homebrew projects. And then since we missed it last week, if anybody wants to stay past the 9 o'clock time point, it's completely optional. Bob will be talking, will be available to give his APRS presentation after 9 o'clock that we did not have a chance to do last week. So if anybody is interested in that, just stick around after 9 o'clock and Bob will get to that. Sebastian, did you have any changes for tonight's schedule?
No, we'll see if we manage to get through everything.
Okay, great. Any questions right now? Okay, and with that, I leave it in Sebastian's very capable hands.
All right, let's start with the first challenge, how to share my screen. There we go.
And just a reminder, if you could please mute until you have a question, we would greatly appreciate it.
All right, you should be seeing something. What do you see?
Chapter 4, topic 10, weak signal propagation.
Perfect. That's a great fit. That's what I wanted to show. All right, perfect. So we're going to talk about weak signal propagation, and that just sounds so boring because who cares about weak signals? The problem is that these weak signals actually can travel further than you think. And there are a couple of those cases. And if you have just your little handheld radio, you will find yourself sometimes really confused how far you can actually reach. So if you stand at the beach, the horizon is about 3-5 miles out, depending on how high you stand, and you can still reach things that are beyond that horizon. So you might not be able to actually even see the boats that you're talking to on your radio. So this is because the Earth in general seems less curved to the radio waves. So then it appears with regular light. So you can actually reach about 30% further in your communication. Just something to keep in mind when you're estimating how far you can actually reach. Because of course, in VHF and UHF, we talk mostly about line of sight communication. Sorry, there we go. So there is also this question that's really important. If you live in the Santa Cruz Mountains or actually in any forest area, which is why do your VHF and UHF signals actually reach much further in winter than they do in summer. And if you look around, you see a lot of trees and they all have nothing else to do than to absorb the energy that your radio spits out. That's also why you see a lot of hams having really big antennas next to their houses, because you want to get as high as possible with your antenna. So you clear a lot of that ground clutter that's actually in your way for your radio signal. So you increase your line of sight, you have less trees in the way. So really good and really easy to spot the houses of ham radio operators because of those antennas. But then the interesting thing is the higher the frequency or the shorter the waves, the more water has an influence on your signals. So if you are talking about a fairly long wavelength radio signal, it will not be impacted by water a lot. So for example, if you want to talk to a submarine, you use really, really long waves. So there are hundreds and thousands of miles long, these radio waves that are generated. While if you're using your regular Wi-Fi with a 5 gigahertz frequency, you will find that even the weather has an impact on whether or not you can actually have a meaningful distance that you can bridge with that. So the same goes with this. So whether it decreases the range of your microwave frequency, that is, of course, rain, precipitation, answer C. And there is a reason why there's a lot of things allowed on VHF and UHF frequencies for people on the technician license. So if you have a technician license, you can use those bands pretty freely. And the reason is that you have much less range or reach with those because your signals are not reflected. So everything that you do stays generally within the line of sight of wherever your signal comes from. So the good thing about that is that you can play along and do a lot of things on UHF and VHF and go into repeaters, but your signal will not be heard necessarily all over the globe. The other way around, you only need repeaters on those frequencies because your signal doesn't actually go as far. So that's why UHF and VHF have repeaters, and your signal stays there because it's not reflected off the upper layers of the atmosphere. So if you are living in the mountains here and I want to get a signal out, it doesn't reach anywhere. My signal, if I look out my windows, no matter where I go around my house, I see basically redwoods and mountains, and the only way our signal could go is up. And so what happens is I can still reach places, for example, even Boulder Creek, which is just a couple miles down the road, because the signal actually goes over the edge of some of those mountain ridges that are around my house. And that effect is called knife edge diffraction. So the signal actually reaches the edge of a mountain and then it curves down. Mike, you do have a question.
Yeah, on the knife edge, the diffraction, are there intelligent ways you can position your antenna to take advantage of that more effectively, or is it something that you're just, I mean, do you get into, tweaking the position or of your antenna in some way, or making alterations to your antenna to better take advantage of that effect?
Everyone is playing with it all the time, I think is the right answer. So the problem is it happens everywhere around you. So you actually have a scattered pattern on where you actually reach. So moving your antenna even a little bit to the side already has a huge effect. And of course, the thing that everyone wants to try at some point is they're going to get a Yagi antenna, so a very directional antenna. And they point it generally in the direction they want to go, and they try to hit that sweet spot where they can actually get all their signal out and have great reception and are heard. And that usually never works. An omnidirectional antenna usually gives you on UHF and VHF better coverage if you're not really just trying to improve on direct line of sight, because somehow the signal still makes its way there.
So it sounds like it's more not necessarily art and not necessarily science, and it's a lot of luck to get it right, in some respects.
Well, there might be people smarter than me that can calculate it, but I think there's too many parameters. For me, it's more experimenting and then being super happy when you find the spot, marking it and finding out that next week's doesn't work anymore. It's kind of part of the game. All right. So there are other effects, and suddenly you're on your VHF radio and you've just listened to everything I said, and you know that this little thing can really not reach that far, and you turn it on and suddenly you hear somebody from really far away. So that happens when there's an effect called tropospheric ducting. Only happens very sporadically, but when it does, it is really surprising. Around here, at least everyone speaks English still. If you're in Europe, you hear a lot of people suddenly speaking very different languages on your little radio, and it's very confusing to you. I had my first radio, I thought it was broken. It was no way. This was actually normal communication. So this happens usually based on weather patterns, and it can happen. So it's usually when there's warm air and cold air trapping a layer in which your signal travels. It's quite interesting when it does. The interesting thing is that your VHF radio can actually create a signal that can get reflected off a couple of interesting things. For example, off the aurora. So I don't think it works around here because I don't think we get the aurora, but if you were living somewhere further north, you could actually get your signal out in the middle of the night and you would actually see the aurora and you'd get this refraction back of a signal. And this is something that reflects your signal back from really high up. So at that point, you have a much larger reach, but there is an effect on what it sounds like. Because if you look at any picture of the aurora, it's usually moving, and these are magnetic fields moving. So they're not giving you a consistent reflection, but they do give you a refraction of the signal, and that makes a very distinct sound. It also looks very distinct. So actually the sound fits to what the aurora looks like if you ever have a chance to try this out. You can also get your signal on the 6 meter band to reflect off meteor scatter. I've never been able to do that. I heard it works. It's still on my list of things to try. I also tried to bounce my signal off the moon in the past. Also, that is something that I still have to really get to work. But we'll talk about space in a little bit. So if you talk about the atmosphere, then there are a bunch of layers that are basically following the alphabet. The ones interesting for us are the D, E, and F layer. This is inward to outward. And the F layers are somewhat numbered. But in general, the idea is the higher the letter, the further out the layer. And the interesting one that we talk about, I think, is the E layer, which is where you have some interesting reflection. But the interesting thing about all those layers is that on the HF radios, you can have a lot of refraction of those layers, and you actually can reach pretty much anywhere in the world, assuming that you actually get that refraction to work. But that's the main difference why there's limited rights for technicians on the longer bands. So the idea is that you stay where the damage that you do is line of sight. When I say the damage, I mean that all jokingly, because I think we all went through that and we all had our incidents. as we got used to radio. So you can actually play in the HF bands, and you can actually use the phone privileges on the 10-meter band. So if you want to try that out, that is actually quite interesting because that gives you already refraction, so you can actually reach really further out. Pretty nice thing to do. You'll find it's a very different experience from using UHF and VHF. But the problem, I talked about this when it happens a lot when I talked about refraction, and that's one of those really interesting points. It is all somewhat sporadic. It depends on the sun cycle, luck. There's a bunch of reasons that play into when a signal is actually refracted inside the ionosphere and then bouncing down around the world. And to find out when that happens and where it can reach, there are so-called beacons. So these are stations that are automated and scattered all around the world, and they send a signal, usually their call sign, on a given frequency, and you can look that up and you can find out where which beacon has been heard, and gives you an idea on propagation. That's something where you just need to ask Google to provide you with this. There are a bunch of really nice websites. Let me see if I manage to share my Chrome. I have way too many windows. There we go. So there are websites where you can actually find out where beacons are and where they're heard. So just feed that into Google and it's going to give you a pretty good result on what's happening in the world. Then there's one thing that gets super interesting when you talk about weak signals, and I need to go back. Sorry, just which is your polarization actually changes, and polarization is usually based on how your radio wave is oriented in space. I think that's the right way to define that. And it is based on its electric field. And the important thing is that there are a couple of conventions. So if you look at your handheld radio, we are using a vertical polarization. So your antenna is vertical. That's important also when you talk on your radio. It might look super cool if you hold it sideways. However, you will be having a different polarization than everyone else talking to you. Your radio works best if everyone holds their radio really, really straight. If you're talking on HF, like the longer frequencies, it is very impractical to put really, really long antennas up because you would need really, really long sticks to put them on. So what happens is that you actually put your antenna horizontally. So that's why on HF radio, you usually find horizontal orientation for your radio signal. However, if your signal is actually bouncing off a natural layer like the ionosphere, then what happens is that it basically gets distorted. So you can receive a signal in horizontal or vertical orientation. For a lot of satellite work, people actually have round antennas that they use so that they can filter out some of that polarization that happens. But in general, you receive and the same polarization as the signal has been sent. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. And this is the same answer. So you actually have a reason why your signal comes in going louder and more quiet depending on if you're listening to something that's actually reflected. It is because the atmospheric layers do not reflect like a mirror, but there's a bunch of different layers and your signal gets reflected and scattered. So you receive signals that are canceling each other out, your own signal canceling itself out or overlapping. So it's sometimes very loud, sometimes gets really quiet. The polarization changes. So there are a whole lot of effects that are coming from the reflection of your signal if it comes through the ionosphere. So that's the same answer C in this.
Where are you? What page?
Good question.
I was following and then all of a sudden
Did I lose you?
yes. Well, I'm pretty lost anyway, but
I think,
Oh.
I think some people only have their phones, so they only have audio and not video. So you might want to say what the question is.
Oh,
That's
okay.
for both.
So this should be page 100 and 101.
good. I was with you until you went to T3A08, but I'm back with you now. Okay, thank you.
Okay, and then the E layer of the atmosphere. So we talked about the fact that they're actually numbered. There's one layer that's the E layer that reflects sporadically, and it works really well on the 10-meter band, and it usually very sporadically on the 6-meter and more as a freak event on the 2-meter band, and these all are reflected back sporadically on the E layer when that happens. So the question was, which of the following propagation types is most commonly associated with occasional strong over-the-horizon signals on the 10, 6, and 2-meter bands? And well, it said occasional. A different word for that is sporadic. So we're talking about the sporadic E layer or sporadic E skip. So answer B on that one. And then the question was, which of the following bands may provide long distance communication during the peak of the sunspot cycle? And that is again the 6 and the 10-meter band that have sporadic E propagation. So that's answer A to that question. And that is really the part about weak signals. And I hope that I lost every one of you at this point. And so we can actually spend a couple minutes on questions that you might have.
Sebastian, I don't know what page it is, but I ordered the new book. They said there was a new book out. Is there anything we need to be aware of in this chapter about the new book? I mean, to me, this stuff is just basic, so it shouldn't have changed at all.
Just make
It's
sure
an
that
open-
you train with the questions, because I'm not sure if there is a new set of questions that the new book might be based on. That I don't know. I don't know what I only have the book with the version that ends on June 30th of this year.
Yeah, so it's good for them. Okay.
But in general, most of those questions, that the content doesn't change that much.
Mhm.
Okay, so then let's talk about outer space. Just to be sure, when we talk about space stations here, most of what we're talking about are actually satellites in orbit. So it is not, we're talking about amateur radio stations that are 50 kilometers or more above the Earth's surface. That's the definition of a space station. It gets really confusing because there is also the space station, the International Space Station, and that one happens to have a amateur radio on it. So the ISS is in fact a space station by that definition. So don't get confused about that. Everything that is 50 kilometers or more above the Earth's surface is a space station. And when we talk about that, let me just change my screen share and walk you through a couple of things about that. So if you look at space stations, there are websites as some, for example, Heavens Above, where you can actually find out information about space stations flying in space. This one is what you see on the screen right now is the location of the ISS right now, and you can also see down here the details about its orbit, perigee height and apogee height, inclination. So a bunch of properties that define the orbit of the space station around the planet. You can also find on the aris.org website information about what radios are actually active on the International Space Station right now. And you can find on N2YO, for example, information about the location of a satellite as well as its beacon frequency and what other frequencies you can use to reach it. So all this information is available for you, and you can just find that, point your radio at the sky, and you can try to get your signal repeated off a repeater that's actually in space, which is really, really cool. So I'll try to stick with the questions they should be generally in the order that they are in the book, and I'll try to follow along in the book and give you guys a reference point every now and then. So I don't want to lose any one of you. So I'm sorry for that if it happened before. So right now in the book, we are on page 103, which is the definition of a space station as any amateur station that is 50 kilometers above the Earth's surface. And we can actually look at the International Space Station website, and we can find out that they have actually a UHF, VHF radio on board. So they are reachable on the 2 meter and 70 centimeter band frequency. So you guys are all allowed to use that band. So does that mean that you can actually just talk to astronauts? And the answer is yes, you can. Any amateur holding a technician or higher class license can actually communicate with the International Space Station. Most of that is actually digital communication, but every now and then you can end up in a situation that you find a astronaut who's willing and available to talk to you. So there is a couple of things we need to talk about when we talk about satellites. So if you look around your neighborhood and you see a satellite dish pointed at the sky, that usually doesn't move, and it's usually pointed at a very specific satellite. So these are geostationary satellites. So they are in a geosynchronous orbit around the equator, and they are usually about 22,000 miles away from the surface of the Earth, so quite a bit. And when we're talking to amateur radio satellites, these are moving very rapidly around the planet, and they're moving so fast that you need to track them with your antenna. So you can see this, for example, at field day sometimes, that you have people with a Yagi antenna that are trying to follow a satellite as it moves between the two horizons. And these are lower Earth orbit satellites, and they are only like 3,000 miles off the surface of the planet. and moving very rapidly. There is a website, amsat.org, where you can actually find all the information about specific satellites and where they are and what frequency you can listen to them on. So what do the initials LEO tell you about an amateur satellite? And the definition of that is that's a satellite in a low Earth orbit. So answer C. That is still page 104 in the book. And you can use satellite tracking programs like I mentioned before, where you can actually see the position of the satellite. You can see the time it passes a specific location, speed, altitude, the frequencies. You've all seen all that when I showed you guys the browser. So that's the answer to this. All of the questions that you see here are correct. And that the set of data that I showed you about the ISS earlier, that's called the Keplerian data set and defines exactly what the orbit of that space station around the planet looks like. And some of those satellites do have a beacon, and we talked about beacons being these devices that continuously broadcast something so that you can find out what propagation is, if you can receive something. And if you put a beacon station on a satellite, it's a satellite beacon. And they usually transmit some information about the satellite. That is the question T8B05, which is on page 105. And if you look at, well, just the same question, just the other way around, is what telemetry information is typically transmitted by satellite beacon? And the answer is the health and status of the satellite. So if you go back, it's exactly the same question. T8B11 is also a question that we've already answered, but who may receive telemetry from a space station? And the answer to that is anyone can do that. So you can use your radio today, turn it on, and start listening to an amateur radio beacon that's flying by, whether that's a space station or not. You can't control it, and you can, of course, listen to everything that you want to. More interesting is that there's also some satellites that even send out pictures. So you get weather satellite data, things like that, that you can receive without even having a license. You just need to know where to listen and what to do with the signal that you're receiving.
I would imagine that a lot of that stuff is being encrypted, though, right? I mean, when, like, especially commercial satellites, they would just want to encrypt their beacon data.
Yes, but if you look at, I think the National Oceanic, whatever, AA, atmospheric, I'm kind of sure what they are. NOAA, the NOAA satellites, for example, they send out weather pictures that they're taking, and they're a government agency. They're providing them continuously as a stream, so you can actually just receive them and decode them.
Yeah, cool. So the government stuff we can usually in the clear, and
some of them
stuff.
Yeah. I'm sure there are satellites that they don't want you to listen to.
Well, excluding the military, right? Yeah. Yeah. Cool. Thanks.
And I believe ham operators are not allowed to encrypt their transmissions.
Yes and no. There's a little bit of a difference for satellite operation signals. So you can use encoded signals to control your satellite. Wouldn't want anyone to do that. And it's a little dangerous up there if anyone could interfere or mess with them. So there is the one case where it's actually allowed to use at least obfuscation. And then if you look at the communication that you'll be looking for, is you'd be looking for FM or single sideband or CW. Actually, these are all patterns of communication that exist with satellites that you can use to look at the communication. So this is T8B04 was the question. It's the last one on page 105. If you are listening to a satellite, you sometimes have a really weird fading effect that you can hear. And that fading effect comes from the rotation of the satellites. So there's two reasons why satellites are rotated. One is to stabilize the satellite, it kind of turns into its own gyroscope. And the other one is to make sure that you keep the solar panels from overheating. Either way, the point is the antenna spins that's attached to the satellite, and as a consequence, your signal polarization changes, and that causes this fading effect. Hence, people are using sometimes round or cross antennas to receive satellite signals. So if you look at movies, for example, and they point the satellite to the sky, that looks like a lot of little crosses that get progressively smaller. That is actually somebody who did their homework on satellite communication. The other part is that satellites move really, really fast. So the ISS, for example, takes about 93 minutes or so once around the entire planet. And so you can actually get the Doppler shift effect in the receiving signal. So if you listen to a fire truck that comes on, it sounds different when it approaches you than when it actually is behind you and actually goes away from you. The sound waves get compressed in front of it and they get stretched behind it. The same happens with your radio signal if you're moving fast enough, and satellites are doing that. So you will actually hear a pitch or a frequency shift in the signal as the satellite approaches you, is above you, or is actually moving away from you. So just keep that in mind. This has an effect on which frequency you can actually receive the signal on. So that is T8B07, and this is the answer. That is C. And the other one is, or T8B12, is which of the following is a good way to judge whether your uplink power is neither too low or too high. And the important part is we talked about the satellite beacon sending a signal. So if you are adjusting your transmitting power, you need to make sure that your receiving volume ends up being about the same, or signal strength needs to be about the same as what you receive from the beacon. That's kind of the sweet spot for the operation of that particular satellite. And if you are looking at a satellite and you see a table in there and says that that satellite works on U/V, for example, that means that the uplink is in the UHF and the downlink in the VHF band. And you've come across those terms before. So that means you can send your signal up on the 70 centimeter band and you can receive the downlink on the 2 meter band. So your regular dual band radio is able to actually cover that for you. Justin, you have a question.
Yeah, sorry, back on the previous question. Is that a different device that measures your power? So it's not solely done on your actual radio base station. You need some additional device like an SWR watt meter or something to be able to match those power levels.
You're looking at the receiving signal strength, and that's something that usually any radio would show you. You'll see that here in the bottom.
Right.
If you need, it's an S meter that's usually built into your radio.
Yeah, thank you.
So standalone SWR watt meter would accomplish the same thing.
Not on the receiving end. So
Okay.
that would only be on the broadcasting side. But here we're actually interested in the receiving side.
Thank you.
So you want the receiving sides to match. You would adjust your output. So there your watt meter would actually come into play.
Amazing.
All right. And that is the first segment. And we're passing it on to Karen. Help me. Who's first?
I believe
Okay.
first up is Nigel.
Nigel, it's all yours.
Okay, all right, thank you. First of all, I'm amazed to see an incredible turnout here. These classes are amazing and they make it all so much easier to get the licenses. I got my technician license in December of 2020 and my general license in March of 2021. My motivation for doing that, embarking on this, was communication during emergencies. That was my first motivation, and in a minute, I'll talk a little bit about what I used to do as a teenager, because this is really following up on some of my interests from a long, long time ago. But as far as the more recent experience is concerned, yeah, I mean, I was one of many evacuated for multiple weeks out of Bonnie Doon. I live on Empire Grade, for those that either know it, on Empire Grade, just past Pine Flat. And of course, the fire got right over the road from us. But anyway, we don't get a lot of communication up here. The Bonnie Doon folks know this, those of you in the city may not. We don't have cell phone, most of us don't have cell phone reception. And also we rely on the internet, Comcast, for example, but those repeaters, they're powered by batteries and they run out after about 4 hours. So sometimes after a power outage, about 6 hours into it, we're without communication. So a bunch of us actually, I think there was a pretty big burst of ham interest in the classes that followed that, and a number of us actually did get our technician license and also participate. Not so much lately for me, but I'll get back into it. But for a while, quite regularly in the Wednesday and Thursday ARIES test networks, emergency network tests. So anyway, and then more recently, a number of folks in the ham radio community have organized, as some of you know, in the Bonnie Doon area, more than 100 homes, I think significantly more now, connected by MERS handheld walkie-talkies, if you like, with local hams as well. So we've been expanding the emergency communication capability to non-hams, with neighborhoods being able to communicate by these walkie-talkies that are then connected to hams who can connect to a network. And there are fairly monthly or every 2 months practices for neighborhoods as well. So that's one of the activities there. Personally, I find the ability to have this communication to be very helpful. These FT60s, which many of you will get, I'm sure, that are useful for communicating on those networks. They are also programmable, the channels for Santa Cruz County for fire, radio, fire, police, sheriff, and so on and so forth. So you can monitor multiple frequencies and stay in touch with what's going on in an emergency. So that's kind of why I did it more recently and why I keep up on it. I have about 3 of those FT60s. I can leave some in my car for emergencies, and I also have a base station as well here in my office. But I actually, since you were talking about propagation earlier, I want to go back in history a little bit. My other big interest in radio started when I was a teenager. And I grew up in New Zealand. So my hometown's almost exactly 7,000 miles as radio waves travel from San Francisco. And so basically I had a hobby. I could not afford to be a radio amateur at the time. Equipment was relatively more expensive than it is now. But as a teenager, starting maybe 12 and 13 through 18 or 19, I was fortunate enough to have very, very tolerant parents. And I got into the radio or shortwave radio DXing hobby, distance hobby, listening, monitoring lots of broadcast stations around the world and writing reports, mailing them off to them and getting QSL cards from those broadcast stations. Stations like, Voice of America, BBC, All India Radio. And at the time, and this was in the 70s, mid 70s to late 70s, Radio Moscow, Radio Peking, just a wide variety of very interesting things going on. And what I didn't realize at the time so much but what I know now is that period of time, say 1974 to 1979 or so, was particularly good propagation. So I could listen anywhere in the world. I had my grandfather owned an auto electrician company, and he had as much copper wire as I could ever want. So I had half-wave dipole antennas for every shortwave band all around my property. And I had a US Army, or actually I guess New Zealand Army, maybe surplus antenna, about 40-foot mast on the roof. And I had a US Air Force AR-88 communications receiver, very, very high power selective receiver, which not at all digital, of course, and valves, but we were able to pick, my friend and I that did this hobby were able to pick up stations from literally anywhere in the world, 100, 150 different major stations. And in fact, just for, and the point being that, yeah, certain times of night, certain bands, the sorts of things that you learn more in these HF high frequencies bands. And of course, we listened to radio amateurs as well, but couldn't talk back. So often on sideband, we could pick up signal from, certainly from all around the world, including the US. I think one of the more interesting stations we received, we could actually hear KGO sometimes from San Francisco on the broadcast band. I mean, the reception back then and the propagation was unbelievable, based on sunspot activity and so on, creating really good ionization layers at different times of the day and night. KNX from Los Angeles even, so lots of that. So anyway, one of my interests in getting back into the hobby now, 45 years later, is to get back into the high frequency HF stuff. And so that you can do 10 meters, I think, as Sebastian may have said, with a technician license, but you can do more bands with the general license, which I got in March. So for me, it's more of a matter of getting time to do that and setting up some antenna and some equipment. But that's what is next for me. So maybe next year I'll come back to one of these classes with hopefully more experience on that side. We'll see.
Thank you, Nigel. Does anyone have any questions for Nigel? Okay, hearing none. Thank you so much, Nigel, for sharing your story. Really appreciate it.
By the way, I have new found, I'm pleased to be on Bonnie Doon here, right on the top of the ridge. I'm going to put up some antennas. I can point them anywhere I want. It's pretty good line of sight to wherever out across the oceans from here. So I'm looking forward to some good receptions.
Okay, thank you. Sebastian, you're up again.
All right, then let's talk digital. You should be seeing my computer screen, correct?
Yes. We see your
Yes.
stuff.
Perfect. So we are on page 109 and we are talking about digital. And if you look at it, then CW, so signals consists of two beeps, short ones and long ones. So you could argue that they are digital communication. And if you send a signal using CW on amateur radio, you are following a specific code that's used, and that's of course Morse code. I think everyone has heard about that. And international Morse code is that answer C on the T8D09. And if you want to do that, there is a specific set of frequencies where you are most likely to meet other people that also want to try out CW, which is a very narrow bandwidth signal. So it is usually at the edge of your band. So you will be able to reach that at the bottom end of the amateur bands. So between 50 and 50.1 megahertz and between 144 and 144.1 megahertz. That's usually a pretty good frequency to catch that. And if you have a receiver that you can set to CW, it is actually very interesting to hear those signals coming in. If you want to send Morse yourself, you will find that the technology is actually quite advanced compared to what it used to look like with a straight key that you were using to form the short and the long beeps manually. Nowadays, you use an electronic keyer that you can move right or left, for example, to create the short and long sounds. So it actually makes things much, much easier. So that is a device that assists in manually sending Morse code. You can also use a computer for different things in your radio station. So when we did, for example, assist the sheriff's department around the fair, we were using a computer to keep log of the activities and what we're sending things to. Of course, a computer can send your signal, it can decode it. So all the different options, you can use a computer for everything in your Radio Shack. No problem with that. And there is a way to use a computer to turn the signal that you receive into a digital format. So usually people use a sound card like that, little tiny box that connects your computer to the box and the box to your radio. And what it does is it takes the sounds that your computer is making, or the digital version of the sound coming into the box, and it generates an audio signal that you would send on your radio. And it would also know when to hit the push to talk feature on the radio to get the signal out. Pretty straightforward little box, very handy. It's called a signal link, and it's kind of a quasi-standard for getting into digital communication with your radio. As a technician, you actually have everything you need to do that. You can do email, for example, things just like WinLink using one of those boxes. So the answer is C, a sound card that provides the audio to the radio's microphone and converts the received audio into a digital signal. So that's the answer on that. Which of the following connections might be used between a voice transceiver and a computer for digital operation? And that's exactly what I talked about. The answer is a receive audio, transmit audio, and push to talk. So that's the capabilities of this little tiny device. But if you do that, there are a bunch of different formats on how people talk digitally on the airwaves. So there are taking a digital signal, it is then encoded into an audio stream, and that is sent over the radio. But however that encoding happens of the digital signal into the audio stream, there are different approaches to that. And all of those, packet radio, IEEE 802.11 or JT65, are all available, most that you can play with. They're all good for different things. So packet radio is kind of the quasi-standard. JT65 is a low signal strength protocol that you can use to get your signal out. So bunch of interesting effects. There is a software called WSJT. You can Google that. It's actually the JT is the JT in JT65 from the question earlier. And that weak signal, I think Joe Taylor software suite actually is used for using very weak signals. And you can use that for sending a signal to the Earth and bouncing it off the moon back to the Earth. Or if you use beacons, or we talked about the meteor scatter signals earlier. So all of these, actually, there's a suite of software that you can use to work with very weak signals. There is another protocol called FT8 that is used quite a bit, which sends also signals on very noisy, under very noisy conditions by using a 15 seconds interval to exchange information between radio stations. It exists mostly for exchanging signal reports. It's not something you'd use for long communication between people. But it is a way to get a signal across if there is a lot of noise on the band. And if you do communication, you have a bunch of ways to make sure that your signal gets through. You can have checksums in it, you can have headers that contain your call sign, and you can automatically repeat a signal that you receive. So all of these are correct on the T8D08. And for those of you who are catching up, that is page 113. If a signal is corrupted, can't be heard because somebody talked over it, because the band was too loud, there was too noisy, the signal didn't get through, there is the option to automatically retransmit that package. And that is an ARQ, an automatic repeat request. And that's answer C on the T8D11. What is an ARQ transmission system? And there is a thing called APRS. And those of you who are listening to me a lot, I talk about that quite a bit. APRS is a way for you to get a signal out that includes your geolocation. So let me show you how that looks like. So this is me driving to work today. I live in Boulder Creek, and I drove down to 280 along 280 to Palo Alto to work. And then I headed back up Page Mill Road and back to Boulder Creek. And on the way, every now and then, I did send out a beacon about my location. So I have a GPS receiver that gets the signal, it encodes it, sends it out, and then it's actually broadcast on the internet. Very easy way to get started on digital technologies in radio. And I think we have Bob talking about that in a little bit more detail. So let me rush through this a little bit. APRS is the automatic packet reporting system. It's not position reporting system, it's packet, because you can also use it to send messages, for example, not just positions. APRS provides real-time tactical digital communication with a map showing the location of stations. So that's what I just showed you. It's just a really long and windy definition of that. And to do that, you of course need a GPS receiver in your system to know where you are, so you can actually relay that signal. And that takes us already to page 115, where we talk about the fact that you can actually have a station that receives one of these APRS signals and relays it to the internet, so it shows up online, as you just have seen. And that station that does that is called a gateway. And that's the answer to T8C1. What is the name? What name is given to an amateur radio station that it used to connect other amateur stations to the internet? Actually, even here in the Santa Cruz Mountains, you have quite a good coverage of gateways or repeaters for digital systems that exist in this. We also talked about the IRLP technology already, I think, in the last session, which is a way for you to connect amateur radio systems such as repeater via the internet using voice over IP protocol. So if you want to listen to N6NFI over in Palo Alto, for example, you can do that through technologies like that. Well, you would not be able to reach that otherwise if you live on the Santa Cruz side. The access to these IRLP nodes happens by dialing a number, so you can actually interconnect them. If you are connecting to a repeater, you can actually dial with the keypad of your FT60, that was already mentioned a couple of times, the number of the IRLP node you want to connect to, and that really works pretty well. There's another system called Echolink, and if you sign up for an Echolink license, you need to tell them your call sign and provide proof that you have a license so that you actually are allowed to use the Echolink system, because when you broadcast something on your computer via Echolink, it gets broadcast through a repeater network. And of course, for that, you need to be licensed. So therefore, you need to make sure that when you sign up for Echolink, plan for a day or so for them to verify that you actually do hold a license. You can also find out from different sources where you can find repeaters or stations that have a voice over IP connection. That's generally the answer. We talked about repeater directories, for example, last time, that actually would list if a repeater is on one of those networks. And another type of transmission that you see quite a bit is an NTSC transmission. This is a type of TV signal, and it's an analog fast scan color TV signal. There's a joke about NTSC because the quality of the signal is generally kind of shifty, and NTSC is a rumor to stand for never the same color, which of course is not true, but something to keep in mind. So if you look at a TV signal, an old TV signal, that is usually an NTSC signal, and that's still being used in ham radio. If you do make fast scan TV transmissions on the 70 centimeter band, then you need to keep in mind that those are pretty wide. There's a lot of data that's being transmitted in these. So we're talking about signals that are about 6 megahertz wide. So you talked about the fact in one of the other sessions that there's different bandwidth depending on which mode you're using. We'll be talking a little bit about that in a while, but 6 megahertz, pretty wide signal, and that's fast scan TV. And I think with that, we're good for another breakout, right, Karen?
Yes. Next up, we have Dan, who's going to talk about working races and parades.
Well, hello, everybody. Yeah, I got a. Okay, do you see a screen about events?
We do.
All right.
That guy's
good.
wearing a lot of badges.
Yeah, really. Yeah, not usually recommended. Like a lot of people, my interest in amateur radio, it has mainly to do with how it can be used to assist in emergencies and natural disasters, etc. And you know, as you've seen from these questions a lot tonight, you know, it may seem that that's hardly the case, but there's a lot of interest in emergencies. And one of the ways we practice for that is by providing public service to events, such as bike rides, horse rides, marathons, you know, just 10K foot races, or other events like the county fair or the Aptos parade, aka the world's shortest parade. And so I've been involved in this events in one sort or another for going on 30 years now, starting with the race through the redwoods. And so the idea behind this is that we're providing a okay, change screens, please. The idea is we're providing communications to the aid of the event organizers, usually being able to give them the same information at many locations. So if instead of them trying to have to call, assuming they even could make a phone call, try and call every location and say, find out, okay, well, where's the first cyclist or where's the last cyclist? We can all share that information together. This picture at the our dear departed Alba Road Schoolhouse is showing where I parked and just to check on the ham radio operator there. And this was a water stop for the the Mountain Challenge. The Mountain Challenge event that happened a couple of years ago before COVID. So, you know, sometimes it'll be we're setting up pop-up and antennas and, you know, setting it up on a table, you know, basically like we would if we maybe had this set up at a shelter. We would be bringing all of our equipment and setting it up, so here I've got some battery power with a little bit of solar assist. This is actually happens to be at Roaring Camp. Sometimes we kind of have more luxurious digs where somebody, in this case Bob, has a motorhome with radios and such inside, and so we can provide those communications. There've been cases like with the triathlon where a bicyclist has taken a crash in places that we didn't have cell service, and we were able to retrieve call an ambulance for the bike rider and retrieve the bicycle and make sure it got safely back home. I'm going to stop sharing. After during the CZU complex fires, several of us provided service to the equine evac and the county animal control by sitting in the vehicles as we went around to feed. Could be anything, chickens, fish, horses, etc., that had to be left behind that were probably safe, but still, when we all had to evacuate, they were left behind and needed fed. So volunteers would do this, and this is hey, it's a genuine public service during a disaster. And it dawned on me that all of these years of preparation for this, I just fell into that role of sitting there and communicating and logging, and it just became second nature. And that's exactly what we train to have happen. So I'm hoping that some of you will be interested in training for this, training for disaster communications after the class is over and you get your license. Somebody asked me the other day about, they're not in this class, they're probably might be joining the next class, about getting a radio, or what if they had a license and didn't have a radio. And I told them it's like, really the priorities are license first, training second, equipment third. A lot of people like myself are inclined to, run out and buy a radio right away. But the reality of it is that a lot of us have lots of spare radios to lend if you're, interested in, like I said, volunteering for a public service event. That's easy. It's the training and the license part that's the difficult part. So, all right, that's all I have. Turn it back over to you, Karen.
Thanks, Dan. Does anyone have any questions for Dan?
I just one quick question. I mean, when you're doing the kind of, let's say an event and there's an emergency, let's say in the case of the bike accident, you're communicating, you as a group of volunteers are communicating amongst yourselves or as kind of in a network via ham radios. But at a certain point, you need to communicate with emergency personnel. And so are you then making a cell phone call at that point, someone who's in cell phone range, or are you actually able to pop onto a band that would be the emergency services would be listening on?
The most of the time, this is whomever is providing the net control, as in the central point of controlling the information, often is at a place where they have cell phone access. Say for the triathlon, we just have somebody that just stays at home and does the net control, and they could pick up the telephone and make that call to 911 over regular telephones. There's some exceptions to that rule is that for events like the county fair, we're actually, and this is not entirely ham radio operation, but there's cases where we are directly talking to the sheriffs in the same. So there are a few, a few cases where we are actually talking to public service people. And a third case has been like during parades where I've sat in the, utility fire unit, and I have my ham radio sitting there, and he or she can hear exactly what's going on, or I can just tell him directly, so there's not don't have to directly use public service frequencies or just happen to be in this co-located with them.
There's also a question by PMC's iPhone.
Yes. Pauline?
I can hear you.
Now you're unmuted.
Now you're off
Yes.
mute.
Thanks, Dan. You indicated the level, the sequence of priorities. Can one train without equipment?
Yeah, part of the training we've mentioned like a what's next class, there's that. Part of involvement in ARES requires training that is often book training or, attending ARES meetings. Right now they're over Zoom, but hopefully they'll go back to being in person. So I'm talking about training like that, or just checking into the nets on Wednesday, which I realize if you don't have a radio, you'd have to borrow one, but
Thank you.
Another quick comment. You were saying the priorities, and the third priority is equipment. I'm going, oh, good thing I've already ordered a radio.
Well, I'm not saying that's a bad thing. It's just, a lot of people have issues with, can I afford this radio? I mean, we've tried to make very inexpensive radios available. I mean, as far as recommendations, but you can spend hundreds on just a handheld radio. And so you can get really caught up in okay, which radio do I pick? Can I afford it? What if I buy this radio and now, a year later, I'm totally not interested in amateur radio anymore? That sort of thing. So we just want to shift people's thinking a little bit from, like I said, my natural instinct to go and yours, Casey, to run out and buy a radio first, but it isn't necessarily it isn't that absolutely the only way to do it.
And if you get a radio and you don't have the license for it or don't know what you're doing, it's basically a paperweight.
It's a receiver until you get a license.
Yeah, you should still be able to listen to things.
That's what I mean. It's a receiver. Yeah, you spent $160 on a for an FT60 that's you can only receive until you get a license.
Okay, anybody else with questions for Dan? Okay, hearing none, we have some more of the book material with Sebastian. Take it away, Sebastian.
Perfect. All right. So we talked about modes earlier. We talked about W. We talked about we talked about FM a lot. We talked about We talked about single sideband that came up on the satellite operation question. So it is actually quite common that there's multiple modes, and if you get a radio that is not a handheld but usually a desk type radio, then you will find that a lot of them actually have multi-mode support. So let's talk a little bit about what that means. The first question is, what is a transceiver? And that is back to the question we just had. A transceiver is a device that can receive and transmit. So every single radio that we're talking about here when we talk about radios are usually transceivers. So that is answer B to the question, what is a transceiver? And by the way, for those of you following along in the book, we're on page 119. And what they do is they modulate a signal. So you speak into it and it generates a radio wave out of it. And it has different ways of doing that depending on the mode you are running. So if you look at your car radio, you usually have AM and FM. AM uses the amplitude to modulate your voice frequency, or actually usually the radio DJs, voice frequency on the signal, while FM changes the frequency and modulates the frequency that way. So it's how your voice gets encoded onto the carrier wave that exists in your radio. And that carrier wave is what you define with the frequency that you're setting on your radio, to simplify it a little bit. The way how this is done is pretty technical, and we're not going to talk about how you can build your own radio. If you have the chance, it's amazing fun, and it probably is a horror for everyone around you, because you will have all sorts of interference if you're not very, very careful. But this is generally how it works. And if you're doing that with your voice signal, there are different modes that you can use. And the question is, which type of voice mode is most often used for long distance weak signal contacts on the VHF and UHF bands? And the answer for that is single sideband. So that's the same encoding or modulation pattern that's also used by CB radio. So citizen band, the stuff that truckers usually do. Single sideband radios are also used in communication between yachts if you're out on the ocean, because you can actually use your energy to get a surprisingly good distance established. And you can use it on the 6-meter band. When we remember, we talked about the fact that that allows you to actually bounce it off the ionosphere. The advantage of single sideband over a regular FM transmission. So if you have your FT60, that usually just does FM modulation. You can get the same or a good voice signal out with a lower or more narrow bandwidth. So the answer is C, single sideband signals have a narrower bandwidth than an FM signal. And then there's a question, which one is an amplitude modulation scheme, spectrum radio, packet radio, single sideband, or packet shift key? The answer to that is single sideband is an AM modulated radio. So it technically uses the same mechanism that your car radio uses, but it actually drops the carrier, but we can skip that part for now in this. But single sideband allows you to get a signal out, the same approach that is used by your regular AM radio in your car when you're receiving something. If you are using single sideband, you have the option of using the signal that is upwards from your carrier wave or downwards from it, because single sideband means that you drop one of the two sidebands. And if you're in the higher frequencies, you use upper sideband for your encoding. Roberta, I really like your encouraging words. Whenever I talk about something that's slightly more complex, you're like, don't worry, it's all gonna make sense eventually.
Sebastian.
Yes.
I think you use the term carrier wave. Can you explain what that is?
Okay, so there is the frequency where your signal is located. That's the frequency that you dial in on your radio. And if you're using single sideband communication, there is a modulation of that signal that sits to the side of that carrier, and it's either on the upper or the lower side of it. In the FM communication, it basically fluctuates in that area. If you had a waterfall that you look at, you would actually see that. If you look at the frequency spectrum, there's the carrier wave, and then you see the actual audio signal to the upper or lower frequency of that. It's a bit difficult to explain. I don't have a really nice analogy to explain, but it's the frequency that you dial in on your radio.
Thank you.
If you look at the following formats, FM voice, single sideband voice, CW, and slow scan TV, the question is which of the following types of emission have the narrowest bandwidth? And we already talked about the fact that CW is usually at the lowest end of the bands, and that there were a lot of communication happening just in 0.1 megahertz. So you can of course assume that for that reason CW is super narrow. So if you use Morse code, your signal has a bandwidth of like 150 hertz, like tiny. If you compare that to the slow scan TV signal that we talked about earlier, that was 6 megahertz in bandwidth. So the amount of different Morse code communication that you can get in the same space on the band that you get a single TV signal in is amazing. So CW is super efficient, but very hard to learn. And then the others take more bandwidth. We talked about the fact that there's very narrow bandwidth that you're using for CW. So if you have a transceiver that is for CW, it usually has a filter to narrow it down to 500 hertz as the section that you're actually listening to. You can get these filters that you can turn on your multi-mode receiver. So these are, again, those desk type radios. There are some that are to carry, but generally, these are kind of the desktop type receivers that have that capability. Now we talked about this carrier wave, and that you usually have one frequency that needs to be generated in your radio that ends up being broadcast over the air eventually. And whenever you generate a frequency, that uses an oscillator as the circuit. That's the core of a radio. And I promise you, we're not talking about how to build a radio. But an oscillator, at least as a name of a circuit, is something you should be aware of. That is used to generate the base frequency that is used to make your radio a radio. So then the question is, and I've kind of lost track of the pages here. We're at T4B08, so that's page 125, right? T4B08.
Yes.
Yeah. So what's the advantage of having multiple receive bandwidth choices on a multi-mode transceiver? So if you have a receiver that can do CW and voice and single sideband, it needs to somehow make sense out of all of this. And if you wanted to take your FM radio and you turn that to a frequency where a lot of different CW conversations are happening, and you're listening to a really pretty wide signal, as you would do with an FM radio, you would just not be able to distinguish different signals. In a multi-mode receiver or transceiver, it actually will select a narrow filter, so you can select only that signal that you want to listen to and don't hear the same band. So you can isolate a single conversation, or in case of CW, a single sequence of beeps that you want to listen to. Now, this is basically bringing us to two terms that actually make up the quality of a radio. One is for your receiver to detect the presence of a signal, and that is the sensitivity. So how low can a signal be that you can still receive it with your radio? That's what you define with sensitivity. The other term is how narrow can you go to isolate a specific signal across the band and filter out all the noise that's right and left of it. And that's called selectivity. That's the second important term when using a radio or talking about a radio. The problem is nowadays, a lot of the radios are really high quality. So sensitivity used to be a big thing. And if you look at old radios, it still is. And nowadays, sensitivity is awesome on really most radios. So there's not that much of a distinction there anymore as it used to be. If you want to take a signal that comes in on one band and you want to put it to a different band, that is done with something like a transverser. So it shifts a signal between bands. And I just want to put this question in here because it's important that we talk about that term. And if there's a question about it, I wanted to make sure we answer that because it's kind of a weird concept. But you can have your radio and you transmit on a 2-meter frequency out your antenna, and you feed that signal into a transverser, and out comes a 5 gigahertz signal that you can send line of sight somewhere, for example. So these are all options that you have to work with additional radio equipment to reach other frequency ranges that your equipment is not designed for. And there is, since we talk about digital in this, there's something called digital mobile radio, and that uses digital encoding of your voice and transmitting that with a time multiplexing approach. That's the same approach that your cell phone uses in sending your signal out. It also sends it in little tiny chunks. The same happens with DMR. The important thing about a DMR signal is it requires a pretty solid connection. So DMR in the mountains, for example, is much more difficult than DMR in the middle of Silicon Valley. And if you have issues with your reception, for example, your entire signal breaks, while if you use classic FM, you reach the point that that it gets a little bit harder to understand, but you still understand the message. With DMR, it just turns into an end of the conversation. It cannot be decoded anymore. But it basically uses digital encoding of your voice and then sending it through the same radio. Now, if you do that, you can define different talk groups, so different people can only listen to each other on that. This is what some of the more advanced fire departments and police departments do, to have isolated talk groups that they can talk to each other without using so many different channels. So you can.
Yep. Interrupt.
Sure.
I have a question about, but you went away from it, about the group talk, the talk group.
Mm-hmm.
And it said something they could talk at the same time. Yeah, that one. To share a channel at different times without being heard. In the explanation at the in the book, Gordo, I guess, said they could talk at the same time, and here it says at different times.
So this is based on this time multiplexing. So your voice is encoded in little chunks that are sent, and there are a lot of different chunks, and so different conversations can happen at the same time, and they get interlaced. So you have different parts of the conversation being sent so quickly digitally next to each other that the communication still works.
So if I encode my radio for my particular group, I will be with my group only and hearing my group and talking with my group at the same time as another group who has encoded for that particular group is talking as well.
That is
that correct?
correct. That is correct. The important thing, though, is to keep in mind that when you say encoding, you are entering a number that identifies your talk group. However, anyone else can enter that same number. So it is not encrypted. You don't own the talk group. You're just only listening to stuff with the prefix of that individual talk group. Anyone else could do the same thing.
I incorrectly, I don't have the terminology down, but I have the understanding, I think. I didn't mean to use the word encoding. I don't mean encrypting. I just use like a number for my particular group.
Yeah, you can have conversation 1 and conversation 18 at the same time, and either one of you would only hear their own conversation.
Because
despite the fact using the same frequency.
Because of the multiplexing chunks. I just want to make sure I'm kind of understanding. Okay, thank you.
That's the same, logically, it's the exact same thing that happens with your cell phone. You and somebody else next to you can use the same cell phone or different cell phone, but at the same time using the same repeater system or network system, same frequencies, it would still, you would still not hear each other well, as long as you're not talking to each other. But yeah. So you can program a group ID into your DMR radio, and it's a pretty cool radio. The voice quality is amazingly clear if you use DMR. However, there are limitations if the signal gets a little rougher. There's also something that might be interesting for those of you who are interested in playing with Wi-Fi. So as a ham radio operator, you can actually use Wi-Fi channels that are not generally available for everyone who's not a licensed ham radio operator, which means there's fewer people there. However, keep in mind that all the rules for ham radio, for example, the non-commercial use, actually do apply. So you can't use HDBaS over any of those and things like that. But generally, there is a way for you to run your your regular Wi-Fi equipment off on different frequencies than the commercially available ones. Pretty cool thing to do. Nice experiments. There's a lot of old Netgear routers that actually work with that. And that is already the digital stuff. And I think we're good for the next break.
Yes, and I think we get to hear from Roxy about her journey with ham radio. Roxy, are you available?
Yeah, I'm ready. I need to share screen.
I think you can just go ahead and start sharing and it'll kick Sebastian's off.
Okay. Thank you, Sebastian. I'm learning a lot. Okay. Let's see. Whoops. Can't help. This is weird. Cancel. Wait. Share screen. Basic. I don't know why it's doing. Oh, sorry. I didn't. This is a new laptop. Unlock. All right, Zoom. Uh-oh. I'll be right back.
Bye, Roxy. In that case, are there questions?
I think Roxy's on a Mac and is security settings for screen share. So Sebastian, do you want to go with just a couple of questions from the beginning and we'll get Roxy as soon as she's back in?
Yeah, we can do that.
We have a question from Mike.
Yeah, I think this is just a kind of experiential question about some of those, talking about digital over ham radio frequencies. Is it when you tune into that without any kind of encoder, decoder, is it just going to sound like a good old analog modem on the radio? Is that kind of the experience? If you tune into something, you're hearing that kind of typical sound, squeals of a analog coupled modem. Is that the experience you would have?
Yeah, I was just trying to see if I can get one, but yeah, it sounds pretty much like that. You can tell the different bandwidth and signals from each other after a while if you listen to it. So Avara, for example, sounds much more pleasant than a 1200 baud packet connection, while 9600 baud is also much nicer than 1200 baud packet. So, there we go.
Sorry about that. Of course, it's like the first time I do anything. And okay, can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
All right, great. Thank you. My name is Roxy, and I've been a tech since 2020, and I got my general license March of 2021, both taking the Aries courses that you're taking right now. So I really thank everyone here for volunteering their time and energy. It's a great resource. I have to say that I feel like I've within the CZU fire and COVID and quarantine, I actually feel like I've gained more friends and like ham family through this all. So you're coming into a very amazing group of people who are just so fun to deal with, and everyone's just like sharing information, and I really do enjoy this particular activity, and it's made my life great. So just FYI, that's how I feel about this. And I would say also, if you're planning on buying anything, just know that there's so many people who have extra things that will give you things and like donate things to you. So if you want to hold on to your money, just put it out there, ask questions. People are willing to help you with time, resources, equipment. They will come over to your house and, throw a line up into your tree, let you borrow things, let you loan things out forever. Just FYI, you don't have to spend a lot of money, even though you can. So within the last year, I've done almost all of the things that Sebastian's talked about. So I've learned Morse code. I've learned how to get on digital. I understand how weak propagation is kind of cool and kind of fun. I've done a few activations, and I've been really involved with trying to understand, my own role in the community and how I can better serve my friends and family. And so, obviously, this little slide is showing a ton of different things. There's like cool stuff like a 3D printed, Morse code paddle, and an app that I use to like learn stuff, a map of all the Aries people that checked in on a random Wednesday night. That's pretty cool to know that there's so many people around you doing similar things and being excited about it. I did try a net control one evening, so you could see on the right hand side I was like madly scribbling people's call signs. So learn the phonetic alphabet. That will help you. I like making stuff. I'm a designer by trade, but I have not ever touched a soldering iron. I've never put things together. I think I do things theoretically and they just happen to appear. But in ham radio, it's really cool that you can learn how to do things by making stuff, and you can start off very inexpensively by making your own stuff. So I just wanted to let everyone know, like, relax. You don't have to be fearless, but you do have to try. And everyone is here to help you. In Aries, there's a person called Neil. He's Kilo November 6, Juliet Oscar India. He is the antenna specialist. He will sit with you during a Zoom by yourself and teach you how to solder. And so within the last year, I went from soldering a piece of wire horribly to a terminal lead to put on the end of my handy talkie so that I could hear a little bit better, to creating my own 40 meter to 20 to 10 meter antenna. And so that helped me a lot because I made so many mistakes. I had to rebuy things because I made too many holes that were unnecessary. and cut things that I wasn't supposed to cut. So yeah, that was pretty fun, but it taught me a lot at the end. This is my home setup. If you do join Aries, what's cool is that you can create your own like go bag, and this is to sort of be deployed and you're kind of on your own, and you might learn with someone else, but in general, like it's all about self-sufficiency. And I like to be self-sufficient, especially since CZU, we were evacuated for quite a long time. And we had, I was kind of lucky that we had someone to have a place to stay. And in any other circumstance, however, we could have been sent to like a campsite or somewhere outside. So I was really concerned about my own well-being and also being comfortable. So I found a tent that essentially could have like an interior stove that could serve as heat and cooking, because I'm always hungry, it seems. So I like to cook a lot. And I used a mobile radio, HTs. Like I said, people give you things. So I bought my own Yaesu, but someone else gave me another radio and some other bits and pieces of it. As you can see here, I actually made, this is the second antenna I made. It's a 2 meter, 70 centimeter vertical ground plane antenna, and that works with your HT. So it's a little bit better than having a whip, and I actually hang it inside my house now, and it helps me hear quite a bit. I don't actually have like a square box radio. I just use my handheld for almost all my Aries meetings. Let's see, I'm gonna skip ahead. This is actually a video, but I'm not gonna talk about it.
Excuse me,
I like videotaping everything. Okay, so talking a little bit about Morse code. I really like languages, and to me, learning Morse code was pretty fun. It was a little bit like, I felt like if I learned phonetic alphabet, I was like, oh, I'm gonna learn Morse code. That's even cooler. And I showed in the first slide, I think I had like a 3D printed key. And when I would use it, it made this sort of clicking noise that reminded me a little, it felt like plastic. So I wanted to get a metal key, and I want it to be a little bit smaller. So this is a key that I bought online. It came as a kit. It didn't come with all the wires and things like that, so I was a little confused because I didn't know how to put it together. So a lot of YouTubes later, after putting together my kit, I did like another few weeks of trying to figure out how to cut apart wire, and then like peel away wire, and then solder the wire. And so essentially, I ended up making the Morse code key work. And I was really proud of myself because it actually worked. So that was pretty fun. Then a year later, this is a year later. So going from like not knowing how to soldering a wire to creating my own like antenna that is about 70 feet long, I think. And it's also an extra like little impedance transformer that is this little square box deal, and then a coil that makes it work on the 40-meter band, even though the length is only usable up to 15 or 20. This took me a really long time. And this is one of those things where you measure twice and cut once, actually measure 3 times and cut once. So even in instructions, I found that a lot of times you need to have meters and things like that to measure things like microhenries. When you cut things and you're like measuring things afterwards, you're like, oh, that was too short. So you have to resolder wires and put them back together. Anyway, I gave up. It was Christmas break, and I put my toroid back on the Christmas tree because I was like, I don't want to look at this thing anymore. And then you come back to it. So this is a journey. It takes a while to kind of figure things out. Oops. Oh, this is me testing it. So it worked. So this is me on the 20-meter band, I think. It's kind of gibberish. I couldn't quite decipher it. It said something like, thank you, KNU, gym or something. So I set up a temporary antenna, and this is like a you can't see it really well, but there's a expanding antenna slash holder that stakes into the ground, and it goes up about 3 meters. So you could put the end of your antenna up on the top, and then it slopes down in an angle, and then it goes to your radio. So this is my external sound card. This is also a dual band radio I borrowed from an Elmer. So the radio goes through the external sound card, SignalLink is one of them, and goes to my computer. And so this particular screen is showing a software called FL Digi. And FL Digi has so many different digital modes on it, like it was overwhelming. I couldn't deal with it. And then Elmer walked me through some of it. So this is him walking me through it. And he taught me how to like put in my like CQ, which is essentially like, hey, I'm out here, this is me. And we went through a couple of the different modes so he could show me what was available. And some of these are really obscure. You will never see them unless you're on digital or at someone's shack. Like it's really obscure. And this is a QSL card. So one of the things I really liked about digital and its weak propagation is that even though the connections are very short and you're just giving like a signal report, you can go really far. And I found that using FTA and WSJTX helped me understand how far my antenna would reach. So it wasn't great for like making correspondences, but it was really interesting in understanding how far I could get. So this is a screenshot of a website called PSK Reporter. It shows me all the way on the left-hand side. This is like a 16-minute ago, like where did you hit with your 20-meter antenna? And it's showing that I was able to hit all the way on the east coast of the United States. The longer I operated, I noticed that I could get even farther. So I live on Empire Grade in Bonnie Doon. I have fairly easy access visual towards San Jose. But my antenna is pretty high. It's about 35, 40 feet up in the air. And it's, I was able to hit like Japan, Hawaii, Argentina, like one little spot near Italy. So that's pretty cool. Let's see, I will run through this pretty quickly. The activations I did kind of talked to what Dan was talking about. I tried to do as much as I possibly could during the year, just so that I could see what being an Aries was all about. And so I decided to try and work at the field day, and this was last summer, I think. Gary actually asked me to volunteer to do digital station, where I could make some contacts on the computer. And so that was pretty fun. So I did a quick time lapse of someone putting up a pretty high, tall HF antenna for, I think it was phone activation. And so I was really excited about this because I got to watch 5 different hams set up their own stations. So one was satellite, one was digital, one, I guess that was me, sorry. Oh no, there was another digital. He ran all the FT8 stuff. I just did the UHF stuff. So this was me sending emails by radio using Packet. You can actually do this through a handy talkie, but I didn't have my handy talkie connected through my SignalLink. Essentially, Karen was great. She taught me how to do this and then troubleshooted me through the whole weekend because I couldn't get my station to work properly. So yeah, it's really important to test and then have other people with extra radios that might be able to help you if you fail. But anyway, This is myself and another operator, Nana, and she and I were in the same kind of like realm of starting. So I encourage you to meet your other fellow hams because they're gonna, you guys will learn together as you go through the course and through your ham experiences together. I met more people doing the triathlon. I'm in the bike industry, and what was really surprising to me was that hams do so much for all the race events, and I had absolutely no idea. So I was really excited to know that hams were the support and doing radio for a lot of events. This was myself and Ralph. He's another Bonnie Dooner, and we did our first activation together at a rest stop in Davenport, and we called in a cyclist who broke her rear derailleur. She was crying that she couldn't finish, and we got in bike support. This is Bike Shadow. Joe Marie was with the car, and we asked them to help, and we troubleshooted it. So they actually took off the rear derailleur, cut the chain, and made it into a single speed. And she ended up taking the bike for the rest of the course back, and she did not finish last. So I was very happy to hear that. So I felt like my worlds kind of collided at that point. Other things that we did were working with Aries. You constantly work with CERT volunteers as well. We did a active shooter drill together, and then there was another deployment or another safety event called Public Safety Power Shutoff. So you practice how to take people's reports in emergency situations. And these things all help build your understanding of how to speak to people and to use your radio in different emergency situations. That brings me to the final kind of wrap up. Yes, sorry.
Can we just skip ahead to the wrap up real quick? I'm so sorry, but
yeah, this is my last slide.
Okay,
yeah.
Great.
Yeah, and so this is our local community in Bonnie Doon. We have created a sort of like a ham CERT mesh across the entire unincorporated city, I guess. And so what is really cool is that a neighbor of mine is a PhD in mapping. And so we created both the location of all the communities and then their radio reception. So we all have MERS radios, but the MERS radios people are all condensed under one ham operator. And so some of these are pretty interesting because we overlap each other, but we also do signal reports, and we are able to kind of share information between all of our communities. And for us, I think that's pretty awesome because we can then have our communities talk to each other and then communicate any issues or emergencies to the ham network and then get out information or emergency kind of issues to everyone else. So that's it for me.
Thank you, Roxy.
Yeah.
Does anybody have any pressing questions for Roxy? If not, we're gonna skip straight on to Sebastian's last section because I want to really respect everybody's time so we can be done with the material by 9. Okay, hearing none. Sebastian. Sebastian, you're muted.
Yeah, there it is. All right. So there are a couple of things that can happen with your radio. One is we're going to talk about how you're talking to your radio, what happens with your neighbors, and what can happen to your radio. This one is somebody tells you, oh my God, you're so hard to hear. What might be off? And the reasons are you might be on a different frequency, you might have your batteries running low, or you're just in a really bad spot and just need to move a couple of feet to the side. So all these choices are correct. If you're really hard to read on the radio, then these can all be reasons for things that might be going on. The other thing, and really happening quite a lot, is that people tend to have too much of strong of an audio signal that they feed into their radio. This can be the gain on your microphone, or it can be that you're talking directly into your radio, and the person on the other end will have a very hard time understanding you, because that is simply not how a radio is supposed to work. So do not talk straight into your radio, talk next to your radio. Important detail. Keep that in mind. And if we talked about that, talk farther away in the microphone, don't speak directly into the microphone. If your transmission peaks, breaks up on the voice peaks, it's the same thing. You're yelling into your radio. Do not do that. People will not be able to understand you just because you're talking louder into your radio. You have a radio for that, to breach the distance. You don't need to yell. If you actually want to have use your radio in a car and there is some sound on the radio, then you can use a noise blanker to get rid of that. The same as if you have old wiring in your house, or you have a neighbor like me that is welding quite a bit. These devices help a lot in keeping your radio usable, even if that happens. Same goes with your running on a generator, for example. Sometimes there is a very high-pitched whine if you talk to somebody on the radio, usually if they're on 101 or something like that. Then you can find out that this is the alternator in their car. It gives a pretty clear sound. It is easily fixable. You can put a choke on your power line, just a little magnet, that knobbly thing that you know on some of your devices. Helps quite a bit to cut down on that. You can also use filters to filter certain things out. But in this case, if you have an RF current that's fed back into your line, you use a ferrite choke. The same thing goes if you have, for example, an HF signal and you can hear it on your landline phone. Landline phones have really long wires that attach them to the telephone network. That's effectively a really big antenna. So if you have an HF radio that you're using, it can happen that the signal is fed into a nearby telephone wire. You can fix that with one of those ferrite chokes that you attach. If you actually have a antenna up and a neighbor has has TV problems, you will always be the one to blame. An important detail to know, not because it's your fault, but because you have an antenna and they will just assume that it's you doing something. So the first thing you do when that happens is make sure that all the connectors that people are using, your own or your neighbors, are actually really good. So for me, it was the fact that I have internet here in the house, and when I was using my radio, the internet would drop. And what turned out is that the Comcast cable going into the house was not really connected right outside my window, and it caused the signal to drop. Very normal thing, happens, easily fixable. It's not a problem with your radio. You're a licensed operator, you're running something on a frequency that's supposed to work, not necessarily your fault. You can also use shielded wire to make sure that you keep unwanted signals from coming back. The same goes with your microphone wires. If you build a repeater, for example, it helps to use shielded wires to keep unwanted RF signals out of your system. But that's mostly if you build things yourself. If you buy equipment, it is supposed to accept interference without not working. So these devices all should be using shielded wires. A lot of them don't. So you'll find that a whole lot of things actually react. If I would hit the transmit button on these radios, the panel lights that I'm using here and there would actually turn off. It's just magic that they do that. There's no reason for it. It is just the way they're engineered, but that shouldn't be the case, and I can't complain about it. It's not the fault of the radio, it's the fault of the panels that I'm using. So just keep that in mind. And if you actually end up with a neighbor showing up and saying that you are actually messing with their TV reception, make sure your radio station is functioning properly, and then you will not be causing interference to their equipment, or it's the fault of their equipment. The same goes with, of course, the first step of debugging this is turn on your own TV and see if it's actually an issue with your radio station. But most likely, it's a problem with the consumer electronics that are not built with the same standard as most of the radio equipment. Now I say most because if you actually go online, you'll hear a lot of people talking about cheap radios and what they might or might not do. If you have a sound in a telephone line, we talked about that, you actually can put an RF filter on the telephone to avoid that. The same goes if you actually have somebody who says that they can receive your signal on their radio. That is usually a fault of the actual radio they're using. It's not a fault of the radio station. Just keep that in mind. Don't always assume that you're at fault. In a lot of cases, it's actually the consumer electronics that you're living with. And you can look at using signal filters to filter out certain things if you need to, but in general, it's not something that you apply to your radio. It's usually something that you need to apply to the consumer electronic that we talked about. Important detail to keep in mind.
Okay, Sebastian, we're a little bit past 9, so I just want to break for a minute. If there's anybody who has questions for Sebastian, now's a great time. If there's people who want to stay past 9 o'clock, Bob will be giving his presentation about APRS. It is completely optional. Please don't feel obligated to stay if you don't want to stay. And if there's people who want to stay after 9 who want Sebastian to spend a couple more minutes on questions, we may be able to do that as well. We'll ask people once people who want to take off for the evening have done so. Either way, please remember to study and do your reading. We're going to be sending out the worksheet for next week, and we'll have another great set of presentations for you next week. So with that, are there any questions for Sebastian or for Roxy? Okay, hearing none, thank you everyone. Feel free to take off if you'd like. And for those who are staying, we'll take a vote on if people want to spend a few more minutes on questions or if we just want to skip straight into Bob's presentation on APRS. Thank you again, everybody, for being here tonight.
By the way, that was the last slide anyhow.
Oh, sorry, I don't have the slide timing, so I guess we don't have a vote to take on questions or not. And I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording because I believe we already have a recording of the APRS stuff.